Even a skyfish, which can soar higher than any other, would not be able to see the ground here, not in Kiborn, stretching in all directions to the horizon. Warm and heavy rain clouds are cast so low that they would almost touch one's head. The trees of Kiborn, which have never been touched by an axe, are old, enormous, and menacing. The branches grown over the years are impossibly tangled, and the branches joined in the air bow down, unable to withstand the weight of dead leaves stacked on top of them. Thus, whenever a strong wind blows, leaves soar from the top of the Kiborn jungle. Large trees sometimes fell after dying, but smaller ones were unable to do so due to their entwined branches, turning into epitaphs of themselves. Among them were numerous dead trees leaning against their brothers next to them, and so Kiborn, which reminded one of a green ocean, bore a chaotic maze full of verticals, diagonals, and horizontals underneath itself in which even birds would become lost. This maze, resembling a lunatic's delusion, grows, bends, rots, pretends to be alive, and sometimes collapses with a loud crunch, dispersing pulverized barks and leaves. However, Kiborn spends its days silent most of the time, imprisoning darkness underneath its green veil. This was where the city of cruelty was located. The place which made even the powerful Lakons cannot help but feel unpleasant when mentioning its name, which made even the cheerful Tokibis to erase their smiles when speaking its name. A place humans who are good at fabrication obstinately refer to as the City of Silence. However, this was the City of Cruelty, which did not require others' praise or curse to prove itself, one of the grandest achievements among the grand. Hettengraj. In the middle of the infinite expanse of Kiborn's green jungle, Hettengraj appears as a lone white island. However, this white island is in fact an enormous metropolis which dwarfs even the cardiospire at its center, soaring 200 meters high. Majestic buildings stood on either side of each straight avenue, and the squares one would come across more frequently than the buildings were decorated with spoils of battles seized by nagas. Other naga cities, located south of the limit line, also sported tall cardiospires and beautiful buildings, but they were fundamentally mere imitations of this grand city of Hettengraj. As with other imitations, this beautiful city was very different from the cities of other races in two different ways. In this city, one would not hear any sound, nor would he find lights evicting darkness. Nagas passed like ghosts without sound between alabaster colonnades and squares, and no voice or song could be heard. Therefore, when Rune Fei opened his mouth, Wart Makaro was greatly shocked. How would it feel like to live with one's heart? Despite having poor hearing of Nagas, who would hardly notice even if a legion of Tokibis marched behind them, Wart was able to understand his friend due to the exaggerated silence in Hettengraj. Wart panicked, vanishing the thought of criticizing his friend's rudeness. Living with a heart? It must mean living every day constantly in fear of death. Rune Fei sensed intense bewilderment in Wart's Neer. As he did not want to inflict any more confusion to his friend, Rune Fei closed his mouth and neered instead. But you could neer, you would also be able to feel you are alive every day. Then Rune raised his right hand and placed it on his chest. Wart would also have been able to feel his heartbeats if he had done the same, but he did not do so. It was too embarrassing. Rune, you don't do that in front of others, right? Do what? You don't touch your chest, right? Don't do that. It's rude. Thinking maybe he neered too bluntly, Wart added, Well, you wouldn't do that anymore in 10 days anyway. Rune put down his right hand, then he turned to face toward the center of Hettengraj. The cardiospire stood there, soaring several dozen times taller than the tallest buildings in Hettengraj. Staring at the cardiospire, Rune's eyes were filled with a mix of hatred and fear. His hands grasping the banister on the balcony were even trembling slightly. Rune Fei and his friend Wart Macaro standing on the balcony of the Fei mansion were the same age of 22, which, according to the norms of Nagas, is not yet considered adulthood. However, in 10 days when the star Shanaga hides behind the moon, they will be called to the cardiospire. There, they will open their chests and remove their hearts. I don't like it, Wart. There's no reason to feel uncomfortable, Rune. No Naga has ever died during the extraction ceremony. The adults are just joking when they say sometimes accidents happen or every year there's always one or two who don't come out. Wart neered kindly, but Rune was still downcast. I'm not afraid of accidents. I just don't like the idea of taking out my heart. Wart was surprised. Why? Rune, you're neering you don't want immortality? It's not exactly immortality. Fine, near immortality it is. Even then, are you neering it's not worth it? I don't think no longer having to fear any enemy is what you would consider trivial. Enemy? Where are the enemies of Nagas? No enemy of Naga exists south of the limit line, and we don't go north of the limit line either. Just where are you claiming these threats exist? Rune's Neer was filled with anger. Wart decided to explain calmly. Of course, we don't travel to the cold land north of the limit line, but those warm-blooded non-believers can come down south of the limit line. They eat grains, so they are numerous, but we can't multiply like they do. The immortal body is our weapon for defending Nagas against the non-believers. They come down here? Rune shouted again with his voice. How? Horses of humans can't move a foot in our forest. The giant lekons can't even move their own bodies, and none of them can see temperature. Unless they can somehow stop night from approaching, how the hell will the non-believers dare enter our forest? Rune yelled like a maddened skyfish. A wave of unpleasantness began to rise in Wart as he observed Rune speak like a non-believer. However, Wart stifled it and neered softly. What about a Togepi? Rune fell silent at the name of Naga's most formidable adversary. Nagas fear neither the horse-riding, grain-eating humans nor the boulder-crushing flying lekons. However, the case of Togepi was a bit different. Wart calmly neered what all Nagas knew well. They say Togepis are Naga slayers, right? We have no way of telling Togepi from their accursed flames. They can't see temperature, but we can't see them either. Also, Togepi's flames can turn our beautiful forest into a pile of ash in an instant. Remember Pesaron Island and Akinsuro Ravine. That's an extreme exception. Togepis never enjoy wars, unless they think it's a really friendly prank, that is. Well, it's still possible, right? I'm not sure whether there is even a limit to how far they would go with their pranks. If I happen to hear someday the world is coming to an end, I'll think to myself, a Togepi lacking self-restraint finally did it. His friend's playful neer brought a smile to Rune's face. I do know a few jokes about Togepis, Rorit, and these jokes are the only things I've ever heard about Togepis. I have never heard anywhere Togepis are dangerous. Of course, they are the only ones who can fool our eyes, but at the same time, they are the only non-believers who have no interest in wars. In that case, Togepis can't be the reason we should be forced to live without our hearts. There may be other enemies in this world we haven't heard of yet. Ah, right. Of course they exist. The enemies. Then Rune shouted with his voice, full of disgust and hatred. They're right there! Wart contorted his face, although he considered himself to be fairly lenient as he was already familiar with his friend's reckless and rude nature. He thought he had gone too far this time. Rune was pointing to the cardiospire. Rune, don't use your voice. You can't blaspheme the cardiospire like that. Even after he put down his hand pointing to the tower, Rune did not respond to Wart's neer, neither with voice nor neer. Wart suddenly started feeling as though he was uninvited. Wart tried to brighten the mood by changing the subject to a few unrelated topics, but failed to elicit Rune's response. In the end, Wart decided to tackle Rune's silent argument. You mean you won't extract your heart? Although Rune still did not near any, the scales on his body rubbed against each other to produce an ominous noise. Wart became sad. You don't really want that, do you? What would they do if I really do want it? Wart sent a Neer full of despair. It's not possible. Tell me, you'd know since you're an apprentice. If a naga asserts that he wants to live and die with his heart, what do the guardians do? Do they forcibly extract? No, the guardians won't do anything, but I do know some cases that would help you. There were a few nagas who weren't able to attend the extraction ceremony when they turned 22, due to circumstances beyond their control and such. What happened to them? The women were of course protected by their families until the next year, then had their hearts extracted without any problem. And the men? They had to desperately go into hiding until the next year, but no one survived. They were all killed. Killed? By who? Don't pretend like you don't know what I'm talking about, Rune. You're the one who neered non-believers can't come to south of the limit line. However, Wart added, they were all killed by nagas. Rune's scales struck each other again in cacophony. Wart sat again on his chair. A box was placed on top of the table. He had brought it as a present to dine with his friend, but this was no longer the mood that called for it. Peering into the box, Wart neered. Rune, the Fey family will no longer protect you after 10 days. You'll be a free man after that. But there is a difference between a free man and a free prey. Should you extract your heart, women will recognize you as a man, but if you don't, you're nothing but a Fey naga. They'll track you, then kill you, and then... Wart turned to Rune. However, his hand loomed over the box. Suddenly, his hand plunged into the box like lightning. When Wart's hand emerged, it was clasping a large rat. The rat squeaked desperately, but Wart neered, keeping his eyes fixed at Rune. They may even eat you. With a stiff expression, Rin Fei looked back at Wart, who was bringing the rat toward his mouth. With a crunch of breaking bones, the squeaks stopped.